During the last half of this century, and in particular the last 30 years, the rise of distance education, its practice and its principles have made significant contributions to the thought of education in general. One of the major contributions comes in the concept of autonomy of learning or autonomous learner. Now, to understand this concept in the context of distance education, it is best that we talk about this concept at 3 stages. At the first stage, we talk about the context in which we shall understand this concept clearly. At the second stage, we shall try to explore the various interpretations pertaining to this concept. And at the last stage, that is the third in this case, we shall try to see the relationship between this concept and distance education. So the theme of today's presentation is essentially the concept of autonomous learner or autonomy in learning. And as I said, the first stage we shall talk about is the context. Now, the context is essentially that of education. Conventionally, one of the major focuses, one of the major purposes of education has all along been to produce a knowledgeable, enlightened person. Now, what does it mean? It means that through education, a person got various concepts, various values, and various skills. And these concepts, these values and skills prepared this man to live a purposeful social life, be productive in his life, and live a good life. Now, the concept of education in this sense has been seen as having a sort of terminal, a sort of terminus. And a person whom we call an educated person perhaps reaches this terminus, and then from this terminus enters a new domain, the domain of life. So in this sense, education was something like a product which was available to the institution or the teacher, and which the institution or the teacher transmitted to the learner. But more recently, we have noticed that things have been changing, and things have been changing very, very fast. We notice that facts that were facts yesterday are no more so today. There are new facts emerging, and facts are changing very, very rapidly. The same is true about concepts. Concepts are changing, values are changing, and skills and the need for new skills are changing. Now, the rate of change is abnormal by our traditional standards. Things are changing very, very fast. Now, this change has to be accommodated, and it pressurizes a learner or a normal person, a common person in a social milieu to be ready to learn new things. The social environment forces this learner to learn new things and learn them fast. Now, this sort of scenario makes education dependent on learning, dependent on a learner. Now, this significance of the process of learning, the learner himself, brings us to the notion of learning society. What is a learning society? A learning society is a society where each individual becomes a lifelong learner. Education ceases to be a terminal activity. Education becomes a lifelong activity. It is the environment, it is the society that forces this on a learner. I think it is best understood through an example. The example that comes to my mind straight away is, let us think of a document maker. A document maker is supposed to collect information from various sources, abstract it, and put it in black and white. And this activity has been on for centuries. It is on even today. And I'm sure it will be on in the future as well. But with the passage of time, maybe pressures increase on this so-called document maker, and we want more documents in a relatively shorter period of time. Perhaps the first step that might be taken is to bifurcate the tasks. We appoint a different person to abstract materials from sources, and the document maker is just to sit down and put those abstracts together to get the document made. Now, further changes in time and more pressures on his time, we would need him to be giving us more documents, let us say more copies of the document. So the person has to prepare more copies. And in the meantime, we want him to be cleaner in his work. And at the same time, technology has come in. And therefore, this person has to switch over to new technology, which in this case, let us assume, is the typewriter. So he has to learn typewriting. He has to go to the institute and learn it, pick up good speed, and now he can work on a typewriter, give multiple copies in a relatively shorter time. A further change in time and social needs. Typewriters become obsolete, and it is now word processors that come in. And the person, therefore, has to learn how to use a word processor or a personal computer. Now, working on a computer also demands to learn using software packages. And depending on the social setup, depending on the institution where the person is working, the person will have to learn the use of the package that is in use in that institution. And then the models change, new machines come in, faster PCs come in, faster computers come in, more versatile software packages come in. The person has to keep on learning these things. I mean, it is the same old document maker, but initially this person depended on just the skill of writing, using a pen and just an ink pot and a piece of paper. Subsequently, the person had to jump to a typewriter. And from typewriter, the person had to move on to a word processor and then learn different uses of different software packages. Now, this is how society changes, how society forces, creates new learning demands. And if this document maker has to survive, say over a period of 40 years, the person has to keep on learning. Now, 1 century ago, perhaps this person could spend a active lifetime, say 40 years, with his art of writing, just using a pen, ink, and a piece of paper. But during the last 30 years, the person had to keep on learning. If the person wanted to remain in business, be socially productive, active, fulfill social commitments, family commitments, he had to continue learning. Now, this is the kind of demand that a learning society creates. It forces a learner, an individual, to remain a learner ever. So, whatever is learned at one time is perhaps to be relearned time and again. And new things have to be learned in order to support whatever skills one may have picked up earlier. Now, this is the general scenario that we are in today. And it is in this context, this general educational context, that we come to the notion of what we call autonomy in learning. Now, coming to the meaning of the expression autonomy, I shall focus on 3 interpretations. Not that there are only 3 interpretations. Various scholars have tried to explain this concept, this expression, in various ways. But the 3 that I have chosen for this interpretation seem to be the more significant ones. The first of them is where autonomy is seen as independence. So autonomy is equated with independence. Independence from what? Independence from the shackles of time as far as learning is concerned. Independence from the shackles of speed as far as, again, learning is concerned. Independence from space, that is, where learning takes place or where teaching takes place. And also independence from the environmental hookups. Now, what do we mean by this? Say, independence from time. The conventional system will force a learner to complete a certain course or a program, let us say in 3 years, as far as the degree courses are concerned in our country. But interpretation of autonomy would suggest that the learner should be allowed freedom as far as the duration of time is concerned. He should be independent of this shackle, this hookup. Say in distance education systems, people are allowed a longer span time. The same way speed. A particular student in a classroom situation is expected to keep his or her speed, learning speed I mean, with that of the teaching speed used by the teacher. But if we want to give freedom to a learner, then perhaps the learner will have to depend on his or her own speed. No two learners are of equivalent levels as far as their intelligence is concerned, as far as their grasp is concerned. It is very clear, all of us know about it, that no two learners may learn at the same speed. So to free the student from this hook-off, from this difficulty of speed, if we could set him free or her free from this sort of difficulty, perhaps learning will be more successful. The same way the place, dependence of the rigidity of place, we force a student to be in a lab, to be in a classroom. But maybe a student would learn better in a different location, maybe at home, maybe in a garden or somewhere else, depending on the temperament of the learner or even the environment of the learner. So wherever we can find a method, a way of teaching, and on the part of the learner, a way of learning, where the learner is free from these shackles. These shackles have been built up over the period of time, over, you see, centuries in certain cases, and they have become rigidities. If we allowed student a freedom, independence from these difficulties, we would then say that the learner is autonomous. He is free from these difficulties. The second interpretation of the expression autonomy refers to learner's choices with regard to his organization of studies. In this case, learner is expected to make independent exercise of his responsibilities. Responsibilities in connection with learning, whatever materials, whatever courses, whatever programs a learner wants to go through. In operational terms, it has 4 stages, 4 occasions to make choices. The first one is where the learner makes a choice with regard to the objectives of his or her learning. It is the learner who decides what is to be achieved through a particular exercise in learning. Having decided the objectives, it is the learner again who decides on the methodology, what methods he or she would use to achieve those objectives. Thirdly, then come the materials, the study materials. What type of study materials the learner would use, using the chosen methodology to achieve the objectives fixed. And the fourth stage is to decide on the evaluation schemes. That is, what is the level of performance that the learner wants to reach? In other words, there are these 4 fundamental curricular elements, the objectives of learning, the methodology to be used to learn something or to achieve those objectives, and the study materials that one may use to achieve those objectives through the methodology decided, and also the evaluation schemes. All this is to be done by the learner himself. And if a learner does that, we say that the learner is autonomous. In this case, very often a question is asked whether it is possible for each learner to decide on the objectives and then also to decide on methodology and the materials and then the evaluation schemes. Does it really happen? Or is it just an idealistic situation? Seemingly, it does look like an idealistic situation, but the fact remains that in a learning society, it is not really a difficult situation. We may go back to our earlier example of the document maker. If you recall that, we have seen at each stage that document maker has to make choices. That is, having moved on to new technology of typewriters, the learner makes a choice. The document maker makes a choice to move on to the typewriter, then give up typewriter and move on to a word processor, and from word processor of a slower speed to that of a faster speed, move on from one kind of software package to a different kind of software package. That these choices that person has to make himself or herself, the document maker, as is the case in our example. In the traditional sense, if we take the case of a PhD student, normally this is the path the student takes. The student decides on what the theme of his or her research should be, what methodology he or she may use, and what materials might be used, and then at what stage the exercise is complete. Now, the kind of scenario, the kind of context we thought of, that is the context of a learning society where things change very fast, it is easier for learners to decide on what the objectives of their learning are. And it is through this kind of exercise that they make demands on the system of education. And it is in this sense that the system of education has to become responsive to learner needs. And therefore, it ceases to be an exercise in selling a product. Rather, education then becomes an exercise in catering to the needs of learners. So far, we have talked about two interpretations of the expression autonomy. Now, both these interpretations pertain to the process of learning. In the first case, we talk of autonomy as independence from the normal rigidities of the educational system. That is, freedom from the time imposition, freedom from the space imposition, etc. And the second interpretation talks about the freedom in making choices. And as I said a bit earlier, both of them pertain to the process of learning. There are some scholars who give a third and different interpretation to the expression autonomy. They look at autonomy as a set of attributes of a learner. Attributes essentially as capacities and abilities. Capacities to absorb, capacities to learn, and abilities to act. Now, these abilities and capacities are supposed to be there in each and every learner. And the various aspects normally talked about are just four. The first aspect of this kind of attribute is that this attribute is found in varying degrees in varying learners. That is, a particular learner may be more autonomous temperamentally and in terms of his or her attributes than some other learner. In which case, the implication is that a person who is less autonomous can be, through learning, made more autonomous. Now, the second aspect is, as far as learners are concerned, some may possess these attributes but never use them. Again, in this case, they have to be taught to use them, how to exercise these attributes. And the third aspect of these attributes is that they dissolve or disappear if they remain disused. Therefore, it becomes the paramount business of the educational system to put learners on a path where they are, in a sense, forced to use these attributes, whereby they get sharpened, and therefore learners become more effective as operators within the system of education. Then there is a fourth aspect, that a particular learner may be able to use these attributes in one sphere, while as the same learner may not be able to use these attributes in a different sphere. A simple example could be of a person who has a family, has commitments towards his family, has social commitments, and is expected to take decisions, at times difficult decisions, but the person does that. Looks at the situation, analyzes the situations, and takes a careful decision. But think of the same person who is expected, because of some situation, to get into a learning situation. He is made to go through a course. He was at an institution, as a university or a college or a technical institution, say 20 years ago. And now he is forced to get into the system once again. He finds himself diffident, hesitates, and therefore we will say at this stage he fails to use his attribute of decision taking. Now again, the educational system should be able to help this learner to get out of that diffidence and be able to use this kind of attribute, the capacity to learn. Now notice that this interpretation of the expression autonomy is a kind of personal quality of a person. And it is seen by these scholars that the educational system should promote this quality. They see that these attributes in varying degrees are present in all of us, all the learners. But the system of education should promote using them usefully, purposefully. Coming back to this third interpretation of the expression autonomy, we see it as attributes of a learner. The learner's capacity to make critical judgments, critical reflection, to remain detached and objective, to be able to take decisions for himself or herself. Now, this notion brings out the relationship between distance education as a system and the notion and the importance of the notion of autonomy within this system. The relationship between the two is essentially something like this. While as distance education is a methodology, it is a mode, it is based on a very strong assumption that the learners that come to this system are really autonomous learners. I mean, they have the capacity, the system thinks, to be able to take their own decisions, to be able to make critical judgments, and also to be able to take steps in accordance to their own abilities and be able to learn properly. Very often we think of dropouts and failures in the system, and these dropouts, these failures are to a great extent because of the weakness of the assumption that the distance education system has made. And it is for the distance education system, therefore, to see that the learners really are autonomous, and therefore it becomes a part of the business of the system to promote autonomy within learners. Now, looking at the same concept in a slightly different way as the process of learning, then okay, the system of distance education provides independence from the traditional constraints on education. It also provides for what we call openness, for example. You see, allows students to make choices in order to go through their system of education or the courses they choose for themselves. So in a sense, the notion of autonomy serves as a philosophic base for distance education, while as distance education then becomes a manifestation, a physical and concrete manifestation of the expression of the notion of autonomy.